So, as you know, the trade negotiations are currently taking place with the EU, but also we are led to understand that the beginnings of the quote greatest deal in history are beginning with the US. Now, this raises some incredible issues for us as a country because, on one hand, we are having to deal with the European Union, and we are in a very specific state. They are right to point this out compared when we've brought this up before to the rest of the world. We are a somewhat large economy sitting on their edge. If we want access to their markets, we have to keep regulatory alignment. But at the same time, we want to do a deal with the US, one that's only going to give us about 0.16% GDP, and it's going to go nowhere near to the amount of loss of GDP we suffer from leaving the European Union, who are our closest trading partners. We've talked about this before. Trade gravity is a thing. You don't see Australia going to do deals with countries around the world. They do these deals, but they don't suddenly just dispense like Indonesia or Japan or New Zealand or China, because they're far closer to Australia than anyone else. And as a result, no surprise there, you'll see them doing more trade with their closer countries than any other country. In fact, the further you get away, the less trade there tends to be. That is a fact that Brexiteers can't seem to get it into their heads. So we are in quite this bizarre conundrum, because the US wants to do this trade deal but insists we have to lower our standards. But at the same time, we're telling the EU that we pinky promise, we really pinky promise that we're not going to diverge. And they go, okay, well, what are you going to diverge? We don't know. We might do sometime in the future, but we don't know. Great starting negotiation position, that. Really great. This is absolutely, once again, Brexit meeting reality and being unable to come to terms with the reality of the situation. And the people to blame here are the leading Brexiteers, Boris Johnson being the one. So here we have the comment section, the opinion section, shall we say, on The Guardian. And this is the article, Boris Johnson's bluster on Brexit is about to face reality. The Prime Minister sold the UK a dream with a casual disregard for reality. The EU trade talks will test his bombast. Bad ideas blunt the sharpest minds, and Boris Johnson's intellect was hardly an instrument of surgical precision. Before it rubbed up against a hard Brexit, the Prime Minister is no fool, but his talents are ill-suited to crafting a new relationship with the EU. Johnson's cleverness is rhetorical. His unique talent is for lifting spirits while lowering expectations. His upbeat bombast is laced with self-deprecation conveyed in his artfully tullest appearance and the elongated ums and the r's that signal improvisation. Although there are lines that he has that are scripted. The whole act is a wink inviting the audience in on a joke, the butt of which are the doomsayers and the gloomsayers, who tried to hold Johnson to his word. He persuades his fans to take their satisfaction purely from the experience of being persuaded. To be seduced by him is to be forgiven in advance for underachieving. The EU is insecutable to that charm. The negotiations that began in Brussels this week will codify legal obligations, I want to make that very clear, across multiple issues, and Johnson's inflated verbalage is not a meaningful currency in that commerce. It can be an impediment to the process when it undermines trust Continental leaders take note when the Prime Minister tells manufacturers that they will not encounter no forms, no checks, no barriers of any kind for transit of goods between Northern Ireland and mainland Britain. Ministers blithely dismiss the prospect of a customs border in the Irish Sea. The truth is that Northern Ireland will end up in a different regulatory space to the rest of the UK. That was a concession Johnson made last year to allow the UK to jettison EU rules without reconditioning a combustible border on the island of Ireland. In a recent speech, Johnson's chief negotiator, David Frost, set out a fundamentalist line on the deviation from continental rules. The capacity to do so, he argued, was the essence of independence and the point of Brexit. When that ethos is pursued in practice, forms checks of some kind of barrier to the inevitability of the boundary between the EU and the British jurisdictions are inevitable. A border in the Irish Sea is not a matter of conjecture. It is descriptive in a treaty that Johnson signed and waved in triumph. But his enthusiasm was for the idea of a deal, not the real thing. He likens deals to their instinct of retail value in domestic policies, believing that problems in the small print can be blustered away. But that is not how trade negotiations work in Brussels, where the deal is the small print. Johnson has absolute cavalier disregard for the facts of Brexit, and this is where his character and Eurosceptic ideology are fused. It flows from an arrogant cultural assumption that Britain is pursuing its manifest destiny away from Europe, and that Brussels, by taking the legislative approach, fails to see things in their true epic perspective. That argument was the core of Frost's speech, which was Johnsonian in a way, and it camouflaged the flabby thinking in historical dress. Smuggled between the references to Edmund Burke and Charles de Gaulle were some strange ideas. The heroic emancipation narrative implies that Britain loves independence more than other EU nations, or that they are just not smart enough to grasp the abject nature of their colonial submission by Brussels. The Johnson-Frost doctrine rejects the Treasury view that disrupting trade between neighbours makes them poorer. Costs are outweighed by, quote, other factors intrinsic to the complex and adaptive nature of the modern economy, which in its unfathomable genius gestures responses we do not foresee, and solutions we did not expect. This hints at the view championed in Downing Street by Dominic Cummings that fretting about EU markets is an analogue for scaredy cats who care too much about gravity and not enough about the weightless digital future. Farmers bleat about borders, but the 20th century belongs to countries that master artificial intelligence. The thesis is immune to evidence and too nebulous to be disproved in the time available for Brexit negotiations. It allows believers to write off any short-term disruptions against national gains down the line. If the Prime Minister believes this stuff, and if he prefers pristine sovereignty in a hypothetical economy to the deference of the real one, he has little incentive to compromise. And if compromise feels embarrassing, he might prefer to obstruct talks and blame the EU's intransigence when they collapse. There is the less pessimistic view. Johnson's priority with Brexit since the election has been to keep it out of the news. He promised voters that he could make it go away, and he wants that illusion to be complete. And to that, he needs any deal he can get. He will be relaxed with compromise because he thinks he can spin the base metal into gold. Most Tory MPs will not sweat over the detail, and the 8-seat majority is a cushion against any rebels who do. Downing Street also expects to force concessions out of Brussels through brinkmanship, spooking the EU by threatening to walk away. In the authorised Tory version of history, that is what happened last year. Theresa May had a bad deal because she was afraid of no deal. Johnson wasn't, so he got a better one. In reality, Johnson's first offer revised the terms of the Northern Ireland, and it was laughed out of Brussels, so he defaulted to a model that he had previously rejected. And this is the dumb thing. This deal that Johnson passed was the very same deal that other hardcore Brexiteers only months ago were voting against multiple times because it was, quote, not the Brexit that was offered, not the Brexit that they wanted. So it is not the Prime Minister's style to admit retreat. So he now speaks of the withdrawal agreement in a fictionalised terms, free from the costs of Irish borders, as if it was the deal he wanted, not the one he got. This is the Johnson method. Sign anything, then sell it as everything. Make any economic sacrifice on the altar of wishful thinking. Compromise for a deal, then disown the downside. The latest tenant is infuriating for the EU side, which still needs to know that Britain, after Brexit, is not a country that honours treaties. It cannot afford to be the rogue kind that doesn't. But Johnson seems to think he can afford the political luxury of refusing to care. And that, my friends and ladies and gentlemen, is an absolute terrifying situation we are in. We don't know what's going on in the negotiations. We probably won't know for at least a while yet. But the government has no idea what it's doing because it had no idea from the start of what it even wanted. Even Brexiteers, going back to the very start of all this mess in the Leave campaign, had no idea of what they actually wanted. Hence why they pretty much sold every single idea going of staying in the customs market and customs union all the way to, quote, the Canada deal. The one that was not on offer and wasn't spoken about until about a year and a half after the referendum was the no deal Brexit. So I think that's, to be honest, is the end goal of all this. I think that's where we are potentially going to end up, and that is going to be an absolute chaos for this country, and that the people who are to blame for this will not be the Europeans, it will not be the European Union, it will not be the Remainers, it will be Johnson and the Brexiteers who campaigned hard for this, and they are already starting to try and hide and cover their tracks. Last week we had the former head, the leader of the ERG, delete tweets about how wonderful the green pastures of Brexit were going to be, about how wonderful all the upsides were going to be. So make sure, because I'm so glad we live in a media-ready world, because we have all these clips of Johnson, Grove, you name them, all these key Brexiteers saying how wonderful Brexit is going to be. And it ain't going to be anything like that. It ain't going to be anything like that whatsoever.